When a narcissist loses someone who genuinely mattered to them, not necessarily in a healthy emotional sense, but someone who provided stability, admiration, attention, or emotional availability, the first response is very rarely grief. It's denial. And this denial is not simply pretending not to care. It is a psychological defense mechanism designed to protect a deeply fragile sense of self. As Dr. Ramani17 often explains, narcissistic individuals rely heavily on external validation to regulate their internal world. So when someone leaves, especially someone who gave consistently and deeply, it creates a disruption they are not emotionally equipped to process in a grounded way. But instead of sitting with that loss, instead of asking what happened or reflecting on the emotional consequences, they often move immediately into self-protection. They convince themselves that the relationship was insignificant, that you were the problem, or that they never truly needed you in the first place. In the early aftermath, they can appear strangely unaffected, sometimes even relieved. They may seem cold, detached, or unusually quick to move on. And for the person on the receiving end of that behavior, this can feel devastating, because naturally you expect some acknowledgement of what was shared, some recognition of the emotional investment, the history, the intimacy. But narcissistic denial doesn't operate according to emotional reciprocity. It operates according to ego preservation. So what you are witnessing in that stage is not emotional strength, it is psychological avoidance. The narcissistic personality structure has tremendous difficulty tolerating vulnerability, especially vulnerability tied to rejection or abandonment. To admit that they are hurt would require admitting that they depended on someone emotionally. And dependency threatens the carefully constructed image of superiority, control, and self-sufficiency they work so hard to maintain. This is why they often create revisionist narratives after the relationship ends. Suddenly, the relationship wasn't that serious. Suddenly, you weren't supportive enough. Suddenly, they act as though they outgrew something they were deeply invested in only weeks earlier. The mind begins reorganizing reality in a way that protects the ego from shame, loss, or accountability, but denial has limits. T.S. What is avoided emotionally does not disappear psychologically. It simply gets delayed. The unresolved feelings remain beneath the surface, often emerging later as anger, obsession, resentment, or attempts to reestablish contact. Because while denial can temporarily shield them from pain, it cannot create genuine emotional resolution, and this is where many people become confused. They interpret the narcissist's early indifference as proof that the relationship meant nothing, but often the opposite is stronger. The denial may become not because they are processing the loss effectively, but because they are desperately trying not to feel it at all. Meanwhile, your task is not to chase acknowledgement from someone invested in avoiding reality. Your task is to trust what you experienced, even if they later attempt to minimize it, because the value of your love is not determined by another person's capacity to honor it. And someone denying their pain is not the same thing as someone who has escaped it. Eventually, the denial begins to crack. Reality has a way of asserting itself, even against the strongest psychological SES. And for the narcissist, this is often the stage where the loss shifts from something they can dismiss intellectually to something they begin to experience as a direct injury to the self. Not simply heartbreak in the traditional sense, but what psychology refers to as a narcissistic injury. And as Dr. Ramani17 frequently explains, narcissistic injury occurs when something disrupts the inflated identity the narcissist depends on to feel stable and in control. Your absence becomes more than the loss of a relationship. It becomes evidence that they were not able to maintain power, admiration, or emotional control over someone they believed would remain accessible to them. And that realization can feel profoundly destabilizing. This is why, after an initial period of seeming indifferent, many narcissists begin reacting in ways that appear emotionally disproportionate. They may suddenly become angry, reactive, obsessive, or highly focused on reestablishing contact. Not necessarily because they have developed empathy or insight, but because the loss has now penetrated the ego structure they were trying so hard to protect. And this stage can be confusing because it often eats mixed signals. One moment they appear dismissive, and the next they are intensely focused on your attention again. They may criticize you while simultaneously monitoring your life. They may act superior while subtly trying to provoke a response. This contradiction reflects the instability underneath the narcissistic presentation. At the core of narcissistic injury is humiliation. Not always public humiliation, but internal humiliation, the unbearable realization that they were unable to control the outcome. And because narcissistic individuals struggle to regulate shame in healthy ways, that feeling often gets converted into anger, blame, or retaliation. This is why some narcissists attempt to regain psychological dominance after a breakup. They may send confusing messages, attempt to trigger jealousy, flaunt new relationships, or suddenly present themselves as transformed and self-aware. The goal is often less about intimacy and more about restoring a damaged sense of superiority. What becomes important for you during this stage is recognizing that emotional intensity is not the same thing as emotional depth. A narcissist reacting strongly to your absence does not necessarily mean they have gained empathy, accountability, or genuine understanding of the harm caused. Often, it means the ego has been wounded and they are scrambling to stabilize it. And this distinction matters because many survivors become vulnerable during this phase. They interpret the sudden attention, emotional reactions, or apparent vulnerability as proof that the narcissist finally understands their value. But narcissistic injury can mimic emotional awakening without actually producing meaningful change. Real accountability requires sustained self-reflection. It requires tolerating discomfort without externalizing blame. And these are capacities narcissistic individuals often resist because they threaten the defensive structure they rely on. So while the narcissist may experience your loss as a profound psychological wound, that wound alone does not guarantee growth. Pain can become insight, but only if someone is willing to face it honestly. And that is the difference between someone who feels injured and someone who is truly prepared to change. After the ego injury sets in, many narcissists move quickly into what can best be described as replacement seeking. Rather than assessing the loss internally, they attempt to regulate it externally. And this is one of the most important dynamics to understand, because to an outside observer, it can look like they've recovered effortlessly. They may suddenly appear in a new relationship, become unusually active socially, or surround themselves with admiration and attention. But psychologically, this is often less about healing and more about emotional anesthesia. As Dr. Ramani17 frequently emphasizes, narcissistic individuals tend to manage distress not through reflection, but through distraction. Distraction can be very convincing. The new relationship may appear intense. The excitement may look genuine. There may even be grand declarations of happiness, transformation, or finally finding the right person. But beneath that surface is often a very urgent need to restore emotional regulation. Because without external validation, the narcissist is left face to face with feelings they have spent years avoiding: shame, inadequacy, insecurity, emptiness. So the search begins for new supply. What's important to understand is that this process is not always fully conscious. Many narcissistic individuals genuinely believe they are moving on successfully. They interpret novelty as healing. They mistake stimulation for connection. But there's a significant difference between being emotionally distracted. Healthy grieving requires stillness. It requires acknowledging loss, tolerating discomfort, and integrating painful truths about oneself and the relationship. But narcissistic structures are deeply resistant to that kind of introspection because introspection threatens the defensive identity they rely on. So instead of sitting with the loss, they seek immediate replacement experiences. Attention becomes medication. Admiration becomes regulation. New people become mirrors reflecting back the identity they are desperate to maintain. But this creates a deeper problem over time, because relationships formed primarily to soothe an injured ego tend to lack emotional depth. They are often built on performance, idealization, and emotional urgency rather than mutual understanding or authentic intimacy. And eventually, reality enters those relationships too. The same unresolved patterns begin to surface again. The same emotional inconsistencies, the same need for validation. The same inability to tolerate accountability or vulnerability, which means the cycle repeats not because the previous partner was uniquely flawed, but because the underlying psychological dynamics were never addressed. And for the person who was discarded or replaced, this stage can feel particularly painful. Watching someone move on quickly can create the illusion that you were easily forgotten. But speed is not evidence of emotional health. In many cases, the faster the replacement occurs, the less emotional processing has actually happened. People who truly heal do not usually sprint into distraction. They pause, they reflect, they allow the loss to teach them something. Narcissistic individuals often bypass that process entirely, which is why the external appearance of moving on can conceal profound emotional immaturity underneath. So if you find yourself comparing your healing journey to their performance of recovery, remember this. Genuine healing may look slower, quieter, and less glamorous, but it creates real transformation. Because replacing people is easy, replacing unresolved patterns is much harder. As the replacement phase begins losing its effectiveness, another psychological process often becomes more pronounced. Image management. At this point, the narcissist is no longer just trying to regulate internal discomfort through distraction. They are also trying to control the external narrative surrounding the loss. Because for narcissistic individuals, perception is deeply tied to identity, and as Dr. Ramani often explains, maintaining the illusion of superiority, desirability, or victimhood can become more psychologically important than confronting reality itself. This is why, after a breakup or separation, many narcissists become intensely focused on appearances. They curate versions of themselves that communicate success, happiness, and emotional invulnerability. Social media may suddenly become more performative. They may exaggerate new achievements, display new relationships, or subtly broadcast the message that they are thriving without you. But image management is not limited to appearances alone. It also involves narrative control. And this is where many survivors encounter something deeply painful and confusing: the rewriting of history. The relationship may be reframed in ways that minimize your contribution and distort your experience. You may suddenly become characterized as too emotional, difficult, unstable, or somehow responsible for the collapse of the relationship. This isn't random cruelty, it serves a psychological function. If they can externalize blame onto you, they protect themselves from confronting shame, accountability, or emotional inadequacy. In many cases, the narcissist is not simply lying to others, they are actively reshaping the story in their own mind. Because narcissistic defense mechanisms depend heavily on preserving a coherent self-image. Admitting fault would create internal conflict they are often unequipped to tolerate. So the narrative becomes a defense system. And this is important to understand because many people spend enormous amounts of energy trying to correct the record. They want the narcissist to acknowledge the truth publicly. They want fairness. They want recognition for what they endured. But narcissistic image management is rarely about truth. It is about psychological survival. The irony, however, is that maintaining a false narrative over time becomes exhausting, because reality has a way of leaking through. Inconsistencies emerge, patterns repeat. People begin noticing contradictions between the image being presented and the behavior they actually observe. And the more rigidly someone tries to control perception, the more fragile that perception often becomes. This is why many narcissists become increasingly defensive as time passes. Any challenge to the narrative feels threatening. Any loss of admiration feels destabilizing. They may react strongly to criticism, attempt to recruit allies, or intensify efforts to appear successful and unaffected. But underneath that performance is often deep insecurity, not confidence. Meanwhile, your healing requires a very different path, not controlling perception, but reclaiming reality, not proving your worth to people committed to misunderstanding you, but rebuilding trust in your own experience and intuition. Because one of the most damaging effects of narcissistic dynamics is the erosion of self-trust. You begin doubting what you saw, what you felt, what you lived through. And healing begins the moment you stop needing someone else's narrative to validate your reality. The truth does not become less true simply because someone works hard to deny it. Eventually, there comes a point where the distractions lose some of their power. The new relationships no longer provide the same intensity. The admiration fades faster. The curated image requires more effort to maintain. And this is often the stage where the narcissist begins confronting something they have spent much of their life trying to outrun emotional emptiness. As Dr. Ramani frequently discusses, beneath the grandiosity and external confidence often lies a profoundly unstable internal world one that depends heavily on constant reinforcement to remain intact. What makes this stage psychologically significant is that external validation can only distract from internal emptiness for so long. It cannot resolve it. And this is where many people misunderstand narcissism. They assume narcissistic individuals are deeply fulfilled by attention, admiration, or power, but fulfillment and stimulation are not the same thing. Stimulation creates temporary emotional activation. Fulfillment creates stability, meaning, and inner coherence. Narcissistic individuals often become highly dependent on the former because they struggle to access the latter. So even when LIF appears externally successful, there is often an undercurrent of dissatisfaction running beneath it, a restlessness, a chronic need for something new, something bigger, something more validating. The problem is that the emotional void itself remains untouched because it was never caused by a lack of attention. It was caused by a lack of authentic self-connection. And authentic self-connection requires vulnerability. It requires the ability to sit with uncomfortable truths about oneself without collapsing into shame or defensiveness. It requires self-reflection, accountability, and emotional honesty. But these are precisely the experiences narcissistic defense structures are designed to avoid. So instead, the cycle continues: more attention, more distraction, more performance. Yet the internal experience remains remarkably unchanged. This is why many narcissistic individuals report boredom, dissatisfaction, or frustration, even in situations that appear ideal from the outside. Because external success cannot compensate for internal fragmentation. No amount of admiration can fully stabilize someone who does not fundamentally know how to derive worth from within themselves. Over time, this emotional emptiness can become increasingly difficult to escape. Relationships become less emotionally meaningful. Achievements feel temporary. Validation loses its impact more quickly. The highs shorten, while the underlying dissatisfaction quietly persists. For survivors, understanding this stage can be incredibly important because it challenges one of the most painful assumptions people often carry after narcissistic relationships: the belief that the narcissist is happier without them. What you are often witnessing is not peace, it is stimulation. Not emotional wholeness, but constant emotional management. Meanwhile, your own healing journey may feel slower and more painful precisely because it is real. You are confronting grief honestly. You are rebuilding identity authentically. You are learning to create stability that does not depend entirely on external approval. And while that process is difficult, it leads somewhere meaningful. The narcissist path, by contrast, often leads back to the same unresolved emptiness again and again, because avoidance may postpone pain, but it cannot transform it. And eventually, the loudest distractions in the world still become quiet enough for emptiness to be heard.